To welcome you to this final day of this year's Festival of Learning and Teaching. I need to start with some sort of admin and announcements. So the first thing to say is we're not expecting a fire alarm. So if you hear buzzers, bells and see flashing lights, feel free to run out screaming because it isn't a drill. The other thing I've been told to remind you is that there have been posters every day. There's another set of posters today. So please take a look at the posters and vote for your favourite because there is a prize for the winning poster. And the last thing that there's a QR code on each of the posters. So if you link to those, it should take you straight to the voting. Also, perhaps an easier thing to get you enthusiastic about is after today's day, there is a social networking opportunity. And for those that don't know what that's code for in Imperial, it's the really nice sausages and slightly dodgy wine. But it will be a chance for everyone. It will be a chance for everyone to have the conversations and to talk about what I think has been a really good festival this year. So slightly more seriously, I want to try and introduce this final day. And I thought I'd start by thinking about what the theme of the festival was. And the theme of this festival is about transitions and transformation. And it seems to me that transformation is absolutely fundamental to our role in higher education, particularly perhaps in STEM subjects. I think what we're having to do is transform our students' understanding, but more than their understanding, I think we transform their skill set and their attitudes. And in so doing, we transform them into having the identity and the confidence to really fulfill their future potential and to really change the world and be a STEM expert out there. Our first day's theme was about discovery-based learning. And it was a really fantastic day. I learned a lot and I've got some notes. I don't usually use notes, but I forget names. So the notes are there for that. And we heard from Professor Achar, who was our keynote on that first day. And he made a really convincing case, I think, that discovery-based learning approach was really important for innovation and creativity. And that also diversity in a discovery-based class setting really added to that. He also pointed out that actually what business and what society needs now is that innovative, creative thinking. That's the way our students are going to be able to impact on the future. We also heard from lots of other inspiring people from across college on that day. I just wanted to point out two particularly that really got me thinking. One was Professor David Schreer's presentation about using AI as a teaching assistant. Maybe slightly worried about the security of my job in the future, whether I might be replaced by ChatGPT, but hopefully I'll retire before then. The other talk that really got me engaged was the fantastic dip into the virtual reality world of emergency medicine, which was for me really authentic. I was really nervous about having to make the choices in a tight time frame. And even though that was a sort of fairly low resolution demonstration of what the 360 virtual reality that the students experienced, I thought it was really useful and really helpful, really helped me understand how that would work. The key thing for me during all of that first day wasn't only that discovery-based learning was a really good approach, and it's really useful for us to do that in our research-intensive setting in our STEM focus area, but it's also that we must try and remember that to get good discovery-based learning, we need to give our students a space to discover in and an opportunity to discover for themselves. And that space needs to be a safe psychological space so that they can risk and experiment and learn from failure, not fear it and avoid it. That for me is the key to a transformational discovery-based approach. Our second day started with a really fabulous keynote panel session, and we had 3 keynotes, and they all inputted a lot of really thoughtful information, and I learned a lot about, I guess, technology in general, but specifically generative AI and assessment and feedback and how it could be used, and you know, I learned some new things to worry about that I wasn't worried about before yesterday, and that's always a good thing in a conference. But the thing that pointed out, the thing that stuck out for me was Peter Kemp's comment, and I think what he was warning us about was certainly in the school setting where he was familiar, there was a big tension between this discovery-based approach and this idea that assessment needs to be authentic and real and have risk in it. There's a tension between that and this pressure to try and close down assessment in order to combat the potential risks of validity that perhaps AI poses. And he pointed out, and I think I really agree with him, that we don't want to overdo the risks of AI at the risk of losing all the benefits of authentic assessment and some of the benefits of discovery-based learning. We have to trust our students to get the most out of it. But as ever, the thing I learned most from yesterday wasn't the great keynotes or all the great other participants from across college. It was from our student panel at the end. I always learn more from the students than they learn from me, and I hope that's because we've got good students, not because I'm a rubbish teacher. But I picked out a couple of quotes from that panel, which I thought were really thoughtful and made me think. The first was one of the students labelled or framed ChatGPT as a learning companion, something that you chat with and helps you along the way to your learning. That made it seem much less frightening and much less worrisome. A learning companion, if we can frame that technology as a learning companion, maybe we'll help our students discover in a good, safe way. They also said that they thought that generative AI and other technology could be really useful to help us as teachers provide timely, good quality feedback. And actually, reassuringly, they did also say that they didn't think that sort of technology would replace the human interaction, and they wanted that human interaction in addition to that good, effective, valid, timely feedback. One of the other things that I laughed about when it was first said, but I've been thinking about it more. I was thinking about it on the train on the way home, and one of the students on the panel said, in this very competitive environment, one of the things the students worry about is the fear that they are going to be disadvantaged because other students are cheating. Or actually, what they said was they are worried that they're going to be cheating better than they were.
Yeah.
And what we don't want for technologies like ChatGPT is to make it an arms race where we have students worried about who's using the best technology to cheat or gain advantage. I don't think our students cheat. I think we do have to trust them. And we don't want to put huge amounts of effort just policing that system. We want to try and help our students and help ourselves frame it as a learning companion. And I think that brings me to the theme of today, which is about students and staff together, and how do we create well-being? So for me, the whole idea of good transformative learning, discovery-based or not, and assessment and good feedback and authentic feedback and feedback that isn't scared of using technology and assessment that's not scared of using technology. The key for that is the human interaction, that safe psychological space where we can all take risks together in our innovative teaching and their learning, and we can all learn from our failures in a way that doesn't disadvantage us and drives things forward in a brave and appropriate way. And I think that's why, for me, the theme of today's final day in this festival is perhaps the most important. I think today we'll have some great talks and some great input from across college that will help us all think about how do we interact with our students for our mutual well-being so that we are all learning and all failing in a safe and positive way. So on that note, I hope you enjoy today's festival, and I hope I will see you at the sausage and wine bonanza at the end. Thank you very much.
You can put me on hay. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Ippolito. I'm a senior teaching fellow in educational development. As part of the organizing committee, I warmly welcome all of you to attend the keynote this morning. And it's so great to see many of you here. And this shows that we care about well-being, right? So it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, my esteemed colleague, Kate Ippolito, who is going to speak about reciprocal emotional interactions in university classrooms, who nuances the feelings of coping and also succeeding and how. Our speaker, Kat Ippolito, is a principal teaching fellow in educational development from the Center for Higher Education Research and Scholarship. She has been the program director of our Imperial MEd in university learning and teaching for 8 years and has been collaborating with colleagues across the college on curriculum development and a lot of other educational initiatives. She is a member of the expert advisory group for Imperial's mental health and well-being strategies, which I think will be released soon. Her research interests, including supporting the inclusion and diversity and help to make our learning and teaching more inclusive and collaborative, especially the role of emotion in education. So I think today we are fortunate to have Kate as our keynote speakers, as she has been doing a lot of work in this area. So, and I also think it is increasingly important for us to recognize the role of emotions in our learning, teaching, and assessment practice, which I think perhaps is not as often discussed as it should be. So Kate will provide the invaluable insight into how we can incorporate and integrate the role of emotions to foster the successful development and well-being in particular. So the presentation will be about 45 minutes, and throughout the presentation, I will encourage you to use the Pedal wall, and I will encourage you to open it right now, because when Kate starts her presentation, you wouldn't be able to access to these slides. So I hope you will have this page open, but of course you can write down your questions on paper. So the idea is that I'm going to pick up a couple of questions to kick off in the Q&A from the Pedal wall, and also invite the question from the audience. Okay, I think we are ready. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kate.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany, for that warm introduction, and welcome everyone. It's great that so many of you could join us today. So let's launch straight in. University learning teaching is buzzing with emotion. In our classrooms, we see students confused about difficult concepts. We see joy when they grasp them, and we see anxiety about assessment. And as teachers, we also experience emotion, anxiety and excitement when we're trying out a new technique, frustration at the perceived lack of student engagement, and elation when it all works out. And as Martin's indicated, we've probably been on an emotional roller coaster this week just learning about teaching and learning. There's growing evidence in neuroscience and psychology that although emotions are individually felt, they're socially constructed among people. This is especially relevant in educational contexts, where our emotions are influenced by the people around us and where we regulate our emotion in association with other people, as we're going to see. Far from being something to avoid or ignore, emotion provides really important social and educational information about how students and we are coping and succeeding in our STEM classrooms. Despite this sort of importance, there's little systematic work looking at the relationship between reciprocal emotional interaction between our student peers and between students and teachers. And this is a shame, because I think it has an important impact on the well-being and the learning of everyone involved. I've been working in universities, teaching in universities for 22 years, and for the last 5 years, I've been thinking about this in particular. And so what I'd like to do is share a framework for better understanding and using the important information that emotions provide. There's going to be a few surprises along the way, I hope, and ending up with implications for your practice. Okay, so given the focus of today, let's begin by linking learning and well-being. As a college, we're developing our first staff and student mental health wellbeing strategy. This is aligned with a national drive to better promote and support staff and student mental health and wellbeing across universities. And the President will talk more about it next Monday, so tune in for that. University UK's Step Change Mentally Healthy Universities initiative encourages us to think about the following question with regard to learning and teaching. What are the positive and negative impacts of university learning and teaching? And assessment on mental health and wellbeing. And as a college, we're thinking in particular about what we can do. And today I'm thinking about us in the room and our teaching and learning colleagues. What can we do, and what are we already doing to promote and support mental health and wellbeing through learning and teaching? Now, some of our colleagues here and outside of Imperial, and possibly even some of you in the room, will say, this is not my role. So what I hope is that my presentation will help you think critically about this, and I'd love to talk to you more about it as we go on, because this is not without its issues. So wellbeing is about working towards valued goals. It's about recognising achievement of those goals, and it's about developing positive relationships. It's also about learning to manage difficult emotions such as disappointment, failure, anxiety. And there are our curricula bursting with opportunities for to experience all of these emotions. But what I wonder is whether these things are adequately acknowledged and supported. And I think that that's what we can do. As part of our curriculum review, we did try and address some of these issues. We better connected our students through active learning. We reduced some of the content. We diversified away from as many exams. But in the recent student wellbeing survey that's just recently published, you know, that there are issues still happening. So students are still saying that there's a high workload. They find the schedule overwhelming. They think that there isn't enough kind of human interaction support from members of staff. And it's kind of sad to see some of that, because we know that there is so much, and you know, how can we close this gap between what they're experiencing and what we hope we're offering? So, you know, these things are important. We can do better, but we need to make informed decisions based on questions like, what emotions are actually being experienced in learning settings and why? And also, why are these emotions important for learning? I think answers to these questions is what's going to help us critically reflect on what students mean when they tell us that they're overwhelmed and so on. Yeah. So over the last 20 years, we've developed our thoughts about the role of emotion in learning. So probably 20 years ago, the general thought was, it gets in the way of learning, let's ignore it. And now the view is much more that it's fundamental to the way that we learn. Neuroscientist Mary Helen Imodinia-Yang has talked about how it's neurologically impossible to do these cognitive processes like remember material, engage in complex thoughts, make meaningful decisions with other people, and transfer that learning without emotion. Even in STEM subjects that are considered objective, logical, possibly no place for emotion, emotion is always evident. It's the thing that motivates us to learn. It's the thing that motivates scientific inquiry. And because we're only motivated to think deeply about the things that we care about and the things we're emotionally connected to. If you think about your research, you do it because you care and because you're interested. Psychologists Reinhard Pecker and Lisa Lindenbrink Garcia have written this excellent text. And these are people who've thought a lot about emotion in learning. And they say there's this like bi-directional relationship, that emotion is unavoidable when we step into a learning setting, whether we're a student or whether we're a teacher. The other side of it is that those emotions are not something we want to design out. They're absolutely essential for impactful and the transformative learning that Martin talked about. If we never feel discomfort of uncertainty or the satisfaction of achievement, then how do we kind of push ourselves and change ourselves? Learning is about change, and change is uncomfortable. And so one of the things that made me quite sad yesterday when I was thinking about AI is, you know, where does the satisfaction come from for us if a machine can do a lot of the things that we currently gain pride and satisfaction from? So we can think more about that as we go along. But now I'm going to ask you to do something. So let's give this a little bit of thought. I'd like you to consider a recent teaching or learning experience that's made you feel good. Let's go positive. And I'd like you to make a note, or just mentally note, a specific emotion that you remember experiencing. It might be this week, it might be very recent. And also, why do you think you experienced that emotion? That's really the key to this, why. Okay. I'll give you a chance to gather that thought. And then in social constructivist style, I'm going to ask you to speak to your neighbour about it. If you want to, you don't have to. I'm going to interrupt you there. Thank you. Thanks for bringing your attention back so quickly. So I hope that was interesting. And now let's take a look at what emotion is and how it can explain the way we feel we do about the emotions in our educational experiences. So first up, we have the kind of universal, classical view of emotions. And this is the view that they're hardwired in our brain. We're born with them. They're universally common across all of us, and they're triggered by things that go on around us. Okay, so perhaps we have quite similar emotional experiences to each other. Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a kind of big name in this area, she's a psychologist and a neuroscientist, not enough to be one or the other. She has a very different explanation, completely different. So the reason I've got that cartoon there, in case you're distracted by it, is you might have seen a film called Inside Out, where a little girl called Riley has these emotions that we're all made aware of. So there's fear, anger, joy, sadness, and disgust. And they basically control her actions. So that's the kind of classical view of emotion, and that's the theory that underpinned that film. Now, Lisa Feldman Barrett has a very different explanation, and this is based on recent scientific understanding. Sorry, recent neuroscientific understanding. So she says that emotions are a goal-based concept that individuals construct all the time based on their physiological sensations, what's going on in their body, churning in their stomach, raised heart rate, sort of things I'm feeling, the social context, their previous experience, and also what they want to achieve. So that's that idea of it being goal-based. She says our emotions are not reactions to the world like Riley's were, there are constructions of the world. This is an interesting thing to think about with our students. She also talks about the social component of this. We're not only actively constructing our own emotion, we're also contributing to the construction of the emotions of the people you interact with. So when you have that conversation about your emotion, you might have had an impact on the way that person feels about what they talked about, but also feels about the next time they go into a teaching situation. In a specifically educational context, the work of Peckert and Perry is useful. So they talk about the control value theory. And this is related to achievement emotions. So achievement emotions are all the things we're trying to achieve in a class. And they lead to things like confusion, they lead to anxiety, but they also lead to enjoyment, they lead to pride. And what Peckrin and Perry say, and other people who talk about appraisal theories, is that our emotions are based on our appraisal of how much control we have in that situation. So we might be asking ourselves, or our students might ask themselves, do I have any choice of which task I do, of how long I take over this, of who I work with? Am I competent at this? Do I think I can do it? What's the likely outcome? If I try this, am I likely to fail, or am I going to do really well? And all of those things impact their emotion. There's also the value appraisal. So learners are also constantly thinking, is this interesting to me? Is this useful to me? Is this important to me? And the reason why I think these theories provide a useful framework in a very goal-orientated place like Imperial is they really help us to link emotion with individual and collective goals. So it makes emotion a very kind of practical tool, if you like. So I wonder, when you look at your responses to the conversation you just had, you can see there whether it's about a goal you were trying to achieve. Did you feel good because you achieved your goal? Was it because you had the amount of control you wanted, or you gave students control and they went with it? Was it because you could see students valued it and perhaps in the past they haven't? Those things will impact on yours and their emotion. So this is a reflection by an Imperial student at a session that I ran with some colleagues that illustrates a fairly common emotional experience that perhaps your students feel too. And so I'm just going to let you read it, because you can read faster than I can read out loud. So by my interpretation, this is strongly influenced by concerns about not having as much control as they like. They feel out of their depth. They expect this academic standard. They're worried that those around them will be able to do it and they can't. But they do appreciate the motivational effects of this anxiety. And that's something Peckrin talks about. Negative emotion can actually be quite activating, and they recognise that. They say it helped me focus. But in the middle paragraph, they're still not willing to kind of overcome that fear and take the risk of joining in the conversation. But then something happens in the environment, perhaps something a peer does, or a teacher, more likely a peer. Something happens that means that at that point, they decide they're willing to say something, and then the experience of not being judged, although they feared they would be, and the value of participating means that they kind of change their view, it outweighs their fear. And then at the end, they say, going forward, they're actually going to change their goal because of that experience that they had. So this is a kind of a bit of insight, and it helps us think about how important the way we structure our sessions are for building psychological safety. Students are always weighing up this balance between risk and value. Loss of control and value. So I'm going to draw a little bit on my research, and just to give you a little bit of insight, it draws on data collected across the college, across 8 modules, which I selected because they're interesting and challenging examples of active learning. The reason active learning is important is active learning is supposed to be engage people actively, cognitively, but it's also supposed to engage us actively emotionally. And some of you might not have kind of thought about that aspect of it. So these are the departments that I worked with, and the sort of cycle that I went through is I met with 3 teaching staff who together in a group. Some of you are here today. And we talked about what emotions do they anticipate, plan for, hope for, support and experience themselves when they're teaching this module. I then invited their students during a session to tell me how they felt about their learning. And 279 of them replied, which was brilliant. That's in total. And then I went back with that data to the teaching team or members of it, and we talked about what was of interest. I'm also drawing on my experience of teaching on 5 iterations of a 10-week Science of Learning I Explore programme that I teach with EDU colleagues. We get our students to write a weekly log where we ask them how the session made them feel and why, and we read those and find them really valuable for evaluating what's going on and getting insight into them. So this is the kind of stuff that I've been looking at. And these are the questions that I ask students. I'll just let you glance through them. And later we'll consider about whether you could make use of any of them. So if we think that emotion is important information for us to have as teachers, would you be up for using any of these questions? Some fascinating answers. I'm going to share some of them with you today. Oh, so what did I find? Well, when I considered all my data and interactions with you guys, which I really enjoy, I found strong evidence of something called emotion socialization. Emotion socialization is a dynamic process in which socializing agents facilitate development of emotional competence, understanding, which includes community relevant ways of experiencing, understanding, expressing and regulating our emotions. And what I found was this unrecognised naturally occurring phenomenon has great potential to support academic success and coping, and it's happening all around us. So just like our students don't arrive with appropriate disciplinary knowledge, why would they study for 4 years if they did? They also don't arrive with the emotional competence to cope and succeed in a place like Imperial. They have to learn that by interacting, experiencing, being, and contributing within those groups. And some of them learn very quickly, but they do need to learn it. Others don't learn as quickly and they need our help. Likewise, as staff in our context, with changing goals and things moving all the time, we also have to engage in emotion socialization so that we can understand how to manage our own emotions and those of our students. So this isn't something that we need to introduce, but if we're more aware of how it works, we can increase its benefits, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So who are the socialising agents? Well, it's you and it's your students. And how do we socialise emotion? We do it by responding to emotion. So when we see one, we might have a conversation about it. We might directly guide students. So we might say, next week's session is going to be difficult. You might feel like this. And we might give them some advice. Or we model. They're watching us all the time. They're watching how we deal with pressure, with anxiety, but they're also noticing what we enjoy. So we could be more deliberate about how we do that. I'm going to tell you now about why I think this is particularly relevant for us in higher education. So the first is that the type of active and transformative learning that we hope to facilitate is part of its purpose is to change an individual through disorientation and discomfort. It's going to feel emotional, and some of that won't be nice. They're moving away from their primary socialisers generally, who will have been their parents, their school teachers, and also their peer network. We're in a very international community, probably one of the most any of us will ever be in. And that means there's lots of different ways of expressing emotion. So something that from your culture might be a very normal way to express emotion is not what I would do. And we're all the time trying to make sense of that. Because the relationship between emotion regulation and well-being is so significant, my view is that we should help students to develop their ability to regulate emotion within the learning settings when it happens. So this isn't a bolt-on. We don't need to be psychotherapists. We know what learning in our discipline takes, and we help students make sense of how that feels as they go along. The student age group we tend to work with are in their late teens to late 20s, and that is when their emotion is most heightened. They're also very aware of other people's emotions. In fact, that starts to decline at about the age of 30. So some of us have got problems in that department. There's also, this is really unprecedented, there's been an interruption in the normal emotion socialisation due to the pandemic, which we've all experienced. We were shut away in our rooms and houses, homes with no contact, and that really interrupted this naturally occurring phenomenon. And as a result, we hear things like students suffering from loneliness. Some of them are finding it quite hard to connect with peers. And then the final point is that actually emotional socialisation is part of professional development. There's some interesting papers written looking at how doctors and nurses cope with the kind of emotional labour of their roles. And I would say that as teachers, we also, have emotional labour and need to socialise our emotion, a bit like you did when you spoke to each other. So one of the things, we're going to have a look at how emotional competence develops. And I don't think we can underestimate the strength of connection between emotion and knowledge in a STEM context like Imperial. We're a community of people who derive great satisfaction from being knowers, which is a great trait, unless your goals around knowing are misaligned with the context. And I'll let you know what that means in a minute. So one of the things that understandably causes Imperial students most distress is, or academic distress, is when they get lost in terms of not grasping a concept or being able to apply that concept. And this is compounded when they compare themselves to their peers. You've probably noticed this. So active learning techniques that we use a lot are, they're kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, they enable learners to realise what they don't know, and then they can work on it, and they provide peers to help with that, but there's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to escape. If you're willing to take the risk, then and manage the discomfort, there's emotional and psychological benefits, but they've got to kind of take that leap. So I'm just going to show you these three very varied responses from students in the same session, and they're learning about statistics and R programming, which is a very complicated thing to do on its own, let alone together. And I'm just going to let you have a look through those. And look how they fall on a continuum. They're all finding it difficult. None of them are saying this is easy or I'm really loving this. But they deal with it in quite different ways. So the first one there feels really lost, don't they, in terms of the content. But maybe remembering all the words isn't the goal. Perhaps they've misunderstood that. It's very much based on other people's progress and not their own, and comparing themselves to others is making them feel worse. The good news is that they are coming to class, they do feel supported when they're there, and they can imagine feeling motivated. So this is all right, you just got to get over this hump. Same session, and the second learner has a much more positive experience because it's based on their relative progress. So perhaps last week they were not feeling very good at all. So they feel they've caught up. It's still associated with the other people around them, isn't it? And then the third person recognises this cycle of emotion that they're going to go through, and they're probably going to go through it lots of times. But what they say is, you know, when you get it done, you regain and you can reconstruct your confidence, and it's stronger than it was before. So they recognise this sort of sense of self-efficacy. This is Marcia Baxter-McGoldrick's epistemological reflection framework, and I think it's useful for thinking about how we help students to explain necessary and unnecessary knowledge-related discomfort and what we can do about it. So when students arrive, they're probably absolute knowers. They think their goal is to obtain the knowledge, and look how uncomfortable uncertainty is. We talk a lot about how we want to encourage uncertainty, but actually if you think that's because you don't know something, that's really hard, and that's probably how that first learner felt. We do a lot of teaching where transitional learning is the goal, where peers work together, and even if there's a correct answer, they're often they're discussing the way to get there, or there might be a variety of solutions. For our postgraduate students or third year, they might have moved on to this independent knowing. And I think that we're usually working at the contextual knowing level. So as you're listening to me now, you're probably thinking, okay, how do I balance this evidence? How does this make sense in my context? Okay, so these are the kind of levels of knowing. But our students aren't the only ones that find themselves in the absolute realm of knowing and the uncomfortable feelings that this gives them. And this can happen for a number of reasons. So the first person here, as you can see, saying, I really struggle with those moments. When students ask me something I can't answer, I really hate that. Obviously, I can't know everything, but I just can't deal with the feeling. We've got some really good students. So this is tough for us as well, isn't it? Look how different the response from the second person is. So they've kind of accepted that there is this challenge with knowledge. They're probably thinking at the transitional stage, transitional knowing stage, and they're modelling that they don't know it to their students explicitly. And from what they see, it seems to be working. This is an example from a first year student, first year medicine module, where, like a lot of us, they're talking about very complex ideas, which isn't just complex for the students, but the tutors too. So they're talking about cellular proteins 1 minute, empathy another. And here they talk about anticipating and planning for this discomfort. So they say we actually preempt it. We say to the students, you may ask us a question, we may not know the answer, but that's all right, because no one knows everything. And you need to get used to that as future doctors. So there's a connection to their professional future. They talk about modelling using Google. Again, that got me thinking yesterday, you know, how are we going to model using AI for our students? We're going to be learning with them. In some respects, they're going to be ahead of us. So we'd be crazy not to think about how that makes all of us feel. So one of the things, having talked about knowing, another aspect that's important is this idea of social comparison. So because goals are so important to us, we really want evidence that we've achieved them. And so Leon Festinger talked about this idea that we will often compare ourselves to other people based on our innate human drive to evaluate our abilities and our opinions. So that's why we compare ourselves. I'm a terrible social comparer. I don't know about you. And it's especially important in a competitive environment, which we sometimes create ourselves, I think, through ranking and so on, and also in the absence of other sources of feedback. So when we socially compare, we do one of two things. We upward compare ourselves to people who are more able than us at that particular thing, or we downward compare ourselves to people who aren't quite as good as us, and that makes us feel better about ourselves, which is kind of important in a sense. When we upward compare, it can be an unfavourable comparison that makes us feel inferior. And we usually do that when we think the person is dissimilar to us in some way, and we just can't have their success. Or we can make a favourable social comparison and we feel inspired by that person. And that is often because we see ourselves as similar in some way. It might be age, background, gender, ethnicity, whatever it might be. And that is very important for us. And what Burleson, Leach and Harrington noticed, and I have too, is that when students move from being a big fish in a small pond to an environment like this with very high achieving peers, so perhaps it's particularly an issue at places like Imperial, it really affects their self-concept, especially if it's built around their academic success and also being more successful than others. So obviously social media doesn't help with this. And one of the things that I've noticed through my teaching is if we can make students aware of this process, then they get better at social comparing. I don't think we can stop it. I think we can just influence it, because they will then, what they often do is they don't use very good evidence for their social comparisons. They worry everyone's better, but they don't really know how much better or at all, and they don't know what strategies those students use. So I've got students to talk about this, and actually what they then start to do is a process I'm calling normalising social comparison. They start to realise that actually they're not that different from each other because it's a much more evidence-informed process. So here we have 3 quotes from students. Look at the difference, not just in the social comparisons, but in the impact they have on students. So the unfavourable upward comparer, they're probably not always like that, they just are in this occasion. I don't feel like others are struggling as much. So quite a fixed view of the better students. I wonder what evidence they're basing that on. And then the second, upwards inspiration comparison. So they're using actual evidence. They've probably noticed that those students are studying and that they can do the problem sheets each week. So they're basing it on something. And then the last one for me reflects really valuable emotion socialisation. These students are willing to kind of compare themselves enough to know what each other's strengths are, and then everyone's sharing their thoughts and they're explaining how they've reached the answer. So they're able to kind of compare, but the comparison helps all of them. And those are some references. So we've thought there about ways of knowing as a way that impacts student well-being. We've thought about social comparison. And the third process I want to think about briefly is empathy. So empathy is a interesting concept because often it relates to helping people who are struggling. And I think that having that kind of deficit way of seeing it is probably not very helpful in our setting, because no one wants to think that they're struggling. I think it's much more complicated than that. And one of the real surprises in my data was students' capacity for showing empathy towards each other as peers, but also towards us as teachers. And when I showed that data to teaching staff, they were also really surprised. So it got me thinking about how we can share this important emotion-related information to motivate you guys as well. So moving away from empathy as a kind of way of seeing struggling, I really like this definition, because for me what it highlights is that empathy is actually a situated, context-relevant way of understanding how someone else feels based on the shared experience of the complex environment. And for us, that complex environment is your classroom, it's your module. You get it because you're there with the students. Empathy comprises three things. There's a lot of discussion about it, but this is what people tend to agree on. So the first is emotional empathy, literally that we share an emotional experience. And the way this works is stage one, I see you, I have to be able to see you, and I unconsciously, without realizing, I mimic your expression or your posture or your vocalization. And then the stage two is that I feel those copied movements as an emotional experience due to mirror neurons in my brain. This is a very well kind of accepted view of how emotion spreads. And some of us are very good transmitters and some of us are very good receivers. The second stage of cognitive empathy is mentalizing. So this is a much more cognitive, conscious thing where I think, you know, this person looks upset. I wonder why that is, or I can understand why it is because I used to study it myself, or I was in the classroom and I saw what went on. I know this student. And then the third bit is that having the intention of actually doing something about it, actually helping the other person. So these are the three kind of processes that come together for us to then display empathy. We had a very interesting experience during the pandemic where disruption, where natural contagion, emotional contagion was disrupted, and the emotional cues that we relied on were missing because we were all online and lots of people didn't turn their cameras on. So we had no information about how they were feeling other than if they spoke and we heard their voice. And I don't know about you, but I felt so lost. And that's what this lecturer is saying here as well, that they found it they found it very difficult to be enthusiastic, and they worried that that was not going to inspire the students. So not only are they saying, I didn't know how they felt, I also was worried that they would feel my lack of enthusiasm. And students felt that too. So in the blue quote, you know, they said it's harder to ask for help, but also it's harder to give others help because we don't know when they're struggling. So that tells me that normally they get a sense that their peers need their help and they step in to do that. So this kind of highlights how in-person support is important for emotional socialisation. And when we think about moving to online learning, we've really got to do something to create that feeling. That's really important. So students tend to use reciprocal empathy as a tool for coping. So they let each other know how they feel, and then they realise that. So one of the most common things they said was that, you know, I realise when I talk to people that everyone's feeling the same way as me. I don't feel isolated. I don't feel like I'm the only one. And look here in this quote. So we struggle together, but it's helpful to lean on others and to talk to each other about why we're stressed out. So, you know, it goes beyond just feeling bad for each other. They come up with strategies. So stress occurs when we perceive that we lack the necessary resources to cope with the situation. If you think about when you're stressed, it's because you just don't think you've got the resources you need. That might be time, it might be ability, it might be the support of other people. And so what they do is they kind of share that stress, but they also kind of identify resources, including each other. And then this reciprocal idea is that they contribute sometimes when they're the stronger person in the group because they know that other times people will carry them. So I can be supported when I'm less confident. So what I would say is, despite all the problems with peer learning and group work, if we look under the bonnet, there's a lot of really important support that's going on. And I think we must keep the group work, keep students in groups for significant periods of time so they can develop this empathy. And where people don't like group work, we give them support. We don't just take away the group work or the peer learning. And then what I also noticed is they also see this reciprocal empathy as a measure of success. Success that looks very different to getting a high grade. But isn't it heartwarming? And look at what they say. So they say, my peers are non-judgmental and helpful, and I aim to do the same. I'm learning from them how to behave in this environment. They also say, you know, I've spent a lot of time trying to get good at programming. I still don't know much about statistics, but I can help other people with the bit I can do, and that's rewarding. So pedagogic empathy is, when we engage in the same learning environment, we understand how much risk, how much effort, and how much trust is involved, and we acknowledge that. That's what empathy is. Let's call it pedagogic empathy for now. And what I'd say is it's a tool for and an outcome of emotion socialisation. It facilitates coping and succeeding. And one of the things that's very interesting that I asked students was, how do you think teachers feel during this session? And their ability to identify how you feel was quite astonishing. They talked about how you enjoy it, you're enthusiastic, they could say why. They said, I think they must feel frustrated because no one's answering their questions, but that's because the questions are difficult. And it gave amazing insight into what they think your goals are, and also to what extent they think that you've achieved those goals. So lots started by saying hopefully they feel proud. I hope they're enjoying it. So this one talks about their explanations and how it's helped them. Another one talks about the online experience. So I think it was difficult for them too. And they may feel sad because they couldn't help and interact with their students. So they also realised, well, we can't achieve our goals. And like I said, people in my study were quite surprised at the way students could be empathetic. Almost all of them gave an answer, all 270 odd, wasn't it, to what they thought their teacher would be feeling. The one thing that they did say where did seem to be less empathy is around this idea of, they seem to make out like it's easier than it is. So I think sometimes we do that. So in my study, I could kind of broadly group the empathetic approaches that teaching staff had. And so some people would say, this isn't difficult, because they didn't want students to think it was difficult. They wanted to kind of chivvy them on. And so let's just step through it. That was one kind of approach. When I was at your stage, I found it difficult. So the reason we can pedagogically empathise is because we've often been in their position. We've studied those subjects. We know those concepts are hard. We remember what it was like. And then the final one there is perhaps more of attention on, how are you feeling about this learning experience? So rather than kind of guessing that it might be the same as us, so some people say empathy, isn't about putting yourself in someone's shoes, because how can we? It's about understanding their position and listening. Have a look at the results. 36. Okay. So none of you would say it's difficult. You're going to acknowledge that it is difficult. Yeah, interesting. And so if you're thinking it depends, which I imagine a lot of you are, then that's you practicing pedagogic empathy. We do it all the time. And that's why teaching well is so difficult, because we're challenged cognitively and we're challenged emotionally all the time. And we're trying to bring those two things together. So I think students talked a lot about being in the same boat as each other. I don't think it's probably fair to say we're in the same boat as them. They probably think we're in a speedboat hovering off alongside, zooming off, looping back, checking they're okay, enjoying our power motorised vehicle. But yes. So I also thought, what about coping and succeeding for staff? So how do you cope and succeed? And because, emotions are goal-based, we need evidence of us achieving our goals. And where do you get that from? I hope you get it every day. But my thought was that perhaps we don't get enough. We probably get it through teaching evaluations. And one of the things that actually caused most negative emotions amongst staff was teaching evaluations, including SOL or NEQ now, NSS, staff-student liaison meetings. Coping mechanisms staff talked about were things like, feeling frustration, feeling upset, feeling really distressed that students didn't understand the effort that they were putting in. And so for me, but we do get evidence of student emotion and then loving what we do. So one person I spoke to said, you know, they remembered that a student had said, this is fantastic, this experience they'd had, it's what I wanted to do at university. And the teaching staff said, that's incredibly satisfying. It was an experiment in teaching that you actually got a result for. And I thought we need to make sure we get more of these results. If we have a goal that we want to achieve, we need to know we've achieved it. And for me, at the moment, teaching evaluation is incomplete emotion socialisation. It's full of emotion on the student part, but we don't understand why they're feeling the way they're feeling. And we don't have a chance to intervene at a point where we could have useful pedagogic empathy and say to them, look, it's understandable you feel like this, here's what we can do about it. So my suggestion is that we need emotion-informed evaluation of learning and teaching. And this could involve asking the kinds of questions that I mentioned earlier, and I'll come on to that in a minute. If we think that emotion provides useful education information, then why don't we gather it, and why don't we analyse it properly? So I'm going to bring it together now. And I've got a model, which is very hot off the press. And I hope what I've done this morning is to illustrate how this naturally occurring process of emotion socialisation that's going on all around us helps students to develop the emotional competence that they need to cope and succeed at Imperial, and possibly even for us to develop it as well. So the community and context relevant processes that are involved in this process are ways of knowing, being aware of the level of knowing that's expected of them. It's comparing themselves to others in a helpful way, and it's empathising. It's understanding how we feel when we're in this same environment together, and that we understand. And the ways that we facilitate this is through our socialising agents, and that's teaching staff. But it's also the peers. We mustn't underestimate that. Hardly any teachers talked about the way they thought students helped to manage each other's emotions. And there's a lot of them and not many of us. So we should make use of that, the way that they do that. And the other thing that facilitates it is goals. We need clear learning and teaching goals. Ideally, they're well aligned. And we need evidence that shows us as teachers and the students as well that we've achieved those goals. That's where the kind of mutual satisfaction is going to come from. And just to end on a few points, there are challenges of emotion socialisation. Managing cognitive and emotional load is demanding, as the student had recognised from their group work. Managing everyone's demand is impossible, and it made their contribution feel unappreciated. So students don't always get this sense of empathy from each other. I also think that normalising and spreading unhelpful emotion and coping strategies is a risk of our emotion socialisation. I don't know if you feel it, but it sometimes feels that at Imperial, it's normal to be overwhelmed and it's normal to overwork. And there's an interesting blog, which is something like, will you still respect me if I'm not overwhelmed, by an academic in the US? And it really gets you thinking about this culture that we've created. Not everyone's going to be willing and able to socialise emotion in explicit ways. If we're underrepresented as in terms of gender, ethnicity, neurodivergent condition, it might just feel too risky to tell other people how we feel. So like lots of things at Imperial, we need role models. We probably need some intellectual streakers out front who are willing to share their emotion with students. And there is this tension between credibility and vulnerability. You know, how willing are we to kind of be open when we know that students are judging us based on our knowledge and so on. But I think that is a risk worth taking. And finally, there's the importance of maintaining boundaries. So Brené Brown writes a lot about empathy. She's excellent. And she says that, you know, a prerequisite to empathy is a boundary. We need to make clear but kind boundaries, because if we don't, we get overwhelmed and annoyed, and that is just not an empathetic place to be. And we also need to signpost and make use of expertise. I see some wellbeing advisors in the audience. We have lots of people who are very well versed in supporting students with psychological issues, and we shouldn't do that all on our own. We should signpost students and encourage them to make use of those things. I've drawn together some implications of what I've said, and I've put them in quite a lot of detail because I'm going to share the slides with you, and I hope these are something that you'll kind of go away and have time to give a little bit of thought to. The first thing I think we need to do is to be, when we're thinking about group work and peer learning in particular, is to be explicit about the stage of knowing we're working at. So is it about that idea of absolute knowing, or is it a transitional knowing phase, or is it even an independence knowing phase? Students, even in our second year, are working at a very independent level. And we need to let them know that actually that is uncertain, that is uncomfortable, that for us as well, as we see. We could stress that working with peers is important for situated emotional learning. You might not want to use those words, and that is essential for coping academically and succeeding. It's not about a future transferable skill. I think we talk a lot about that. It's about how this year you're going to cope with this year. We should allow space and time for peers to form trusting relationships. You know, those with mental health conditions sometimes said, the friendships I've made are what is getting me through. I feel stressed, I have this condition, but actually my friends are very, very important to me, and they make friends in our classrooms, they tell us that. We should scaffold reflection on emotional impact of learning and how this is developing over time. Professor Mark Brackett from Yale has a brilliant model called Ruler that I'd encourage you to have a look at. And we've used this on our Science of Learning course, and it's one of the things that students find very useful. And then, you know, because social comparison is going to happen, we should encourage that to be evidence informed. You know, why do students compare themselves? Who do they compare themselves to? Can that be more normalised? And if we get them to talk about the learning challenges and strategies embedded in a session, they soon realise that lots of people feel the same, that they've got techniques that are tried and tested. And we also need to align peer feedback with this. I think peer feedback's a great idea. And then the final thing is for us, the implications of evaluation of learning and teaching. I said learning because evaluation isn't just about teaching, is it? It's about how the learning happens and how we facilitate that. So I think the first step is to think about what STEM in your learning setting looks like. What are the emotional goals? Maybe this morning you thought, actually, it is about creating confusion and then resolving it by the end of term. It is about them being exposed to stressful situations and then realising that they can do it, together they can cope. And then develop that into a clear, confident rationale, and then gather data to evaluate on that basis. Here are the questions that I use to gather that emotion-related information. And I think you'd be surprised how willing students are to answer these questions. And giving and receiving that feedback is what builds up that empathy that might currently be invisible to you. We also need to make meaning of it as subjective, context-dependent data. So I've sat in lots of committees where we look at student evaluation data as though it's fact, and it isn't. It's really useful data. It's very important. It's very valid, but it's how someone feels about their learning experience, and we need to interpret that in a sophisticated way, not make changes because students aren't happy or don't like something. I think that that's important. We support them and we care for them, but sometimes we need to think carefully about how we react. And then, you know, we can model emotions about how we receive feedback. And some brave souls do this with students. I had one interviewee who was quite upset with some feedback that they'd received, and they told their students about it. They showed it to them, and the students had a conversation about it, and that felt very important. But you know, you've got to be brave to do that sort of thing. So I hope that's been useful. I'm going to stop there so that we can have some questions. Hopefully we've got about 10 minutes for that. Does that sound okay?
Thank you so much for Kate's wonderful presentation. It's a lot of different things for us to take away, and I can see a lot of interesting questions are coming through on the pedal wall. So I'm just gonna kind of group some of them and then just pick up a couple of them, and then we'll welcome the questions from the audience. Okay, so Kate, there are a couple of questions about evaluating student emotion. So yeah, the audience thinks it's a really interesting idea to poll students' emotions in perhaps the place of soul or MBQ. And this seems to be supported by reviewers of student evaluation. But if we are trying to evaluate this, is there any way, like, so how can we embed this into part of the evaluation form, and should we kind of actively encourage your student to think about this differently or respond to this differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to ask how do you feel, we need to ask why. We need them, because that has a reflective element. It gets them critically thinking about, why do I feel that way? Is that actually the way I feel? Peckram talks about this idea that actually things that we assume are negative emotions, like confusion, anxiety, are actually really important for learning. So I also ask students, given how you feel, do you think this has an activating or deactivating effect on your learning? And actually, even those who said they felt quite negative about the session that I spoke to them after, they almost all identified that it did have an activating impact on their learning. So I think that the questions around that could be useful. After a session, midway through the term, at the end of the term are all good times. I know some of you are doing pulse surveys, so rather than waiting for the end of term, you capture the data right when you can do something about it. I think that's valuable, but try it. It's experiential learning, isn't it? When you try it and see the data, I think you'll be surprised how useful it could be to you.
Do you think it might be useful to also have some activities with students as part of that experience? So like you mentioned about the bio-dimensional, right? So if that dialogue can happen in the classroom, or it fits better, I mean, in addition to the evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does fit in the classroom. I think a criticism could be, we don't have any more time, there's no more space. We know that students don't come to sessions that seem to be kind of additional to the mainstream. So I think it needs to be quite naturally embedded into what we're doing. I've also written a handout, which I hope will be useful for personal tutors to think about these ideas, how they could talk to students about, their concerns about their knowledge, about how they compare themselves to other students, about how they're quite sort of hard on themselves. So yeah, that tool should be useful as well, I think. But yeah, classroom environment, group work, personal tutoring. I think these conversations are going on all the time as well. So perhaps it's about signposting them and letting students know that they're important.
Okay, thank you. Another question, which I think is quite interesting, is about our learning and teaching strategy. And it says most of us are aware that stress and moods, so emotion, do spread. So what will the teaching strategy be to be able to regulate emotions, but not have to mask it? Do we disclose it? Because we don't normally talk about these things, right? And I think currently in parents learning and teaching strategies, this is not something that we focus a lot.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts?
I think that's a good point. I think what we don't want to do is go off down the track of talking about emotion endlessly and not doing anything about it. So if the emotion is about high workloads and packed timetables, which means students, they have all these amazing activities, but actually they don't have time to breathe and it's creeping into their holidays. We have to address the real problems that they're telling us about. But I think some of that is about helping them kind of regulate their emotion. Some of them are so driven by the goal of doing academically exceptionally, they kind of forget to look after themselves. So I think that's important. So yeah, I think it is about talking about how we feel, how we manage stress. I think if you're aware of kind of what stress is, for the students I taught recently, just defining stress was something that helped them nail it down. For them, it was something that was making their head explode. And when I said, look, I think I understand it as when we think that we don't have enough resource to cope with the situation we're in, can you list what you think your resources are? They were like, well, yeah, that usually is probably what it is. And I could make more time, or I could help other people. I could ask other people for help. So I do think defining stuff helps to kind of ground it and stop it kind of sprawling out of control.
So I suppose your research can inform the next parents learning and teaching strategies. Maybe that is something that we all need to think about. So from a bit more like top-down approach, because it's very important to recognize that aspect. Okay, great. So I think I'm gonna go ahead.
Yeah, Maria.
Hi. Can I have 2 questions? So the first one is that is connected to one of the sessions yesterday that showed that we are suffering, especially after COVID, with student engagement. So
Yeah.
students don't come
No.
to lectures. Is there any connection or link between student engagement, this social, emotional regulation?
I think that's a great point, and I had that in my mind. So the risk for me, I think, of stress is that if they're not there, they can't take advantage of this process of them realizing that they're not the only ones. Students talk quite a lot in their responses about how they feel the confusion of other people and how that's important to them. So I think, you know, part of us persuading them to come, or perhaps even being a little bit more controlling over their need to come, should stress the fact that the courses are designed for you to learn with other people. And if you don't come, you can't engage with that, not only cognitively, not only learning stuff, but just getting a feel for how the rest of your cohort are. I think it's going to be a tough sell, but for me, I'm totally convinced that if we can't get them in the classrooms, we're going to struggle to downgrade the stress that some of them are feeling when they're sitting in their rooms on their own. So yeah, I really would love to push for that.
And the other one is just because we have been talking a lot with AI tools and that we should embrace and everything. How do you have any thoughts about how embracing AI tools, which is inevitable, has the impact on the emotional regulation?
Well, when I sat there, I felt quite stressed about it and quite anxious and quite fearful in a sense. But what the positive I took was that actually we could relieve some of our cognitive burden by taking advantage of AI tools for some of the basics in terms of knowledge generation and sharing of that. And that frees us up to be a bit more kind of emotionally aware and to guide students along with that. So that was my thoughts about the connection to AI. Yeah, I think it's another example of bringing it together, and rather than pretend that either we're not stressed or, you know, we're not uncertain about it, we can be quite open about that. I think from what I heard from the panel yesterday, students are much more forgiving than we think they are. You know, if we're honest about what we're doing and transparent and say this is why and we're trying this, and they can see that, they have to see we're trying, and then I think that they're kind of on board with that as young adults. Yeah, yes, please. Oh, wave.
I just wanted to link up the idea between the emotion, the idea of belonging.
Yes.
So linking up the two things about the emotion of belonging and how that impacts on students' ability to learn. Combining the two elements.
Yeah, definitely. They're very linked, aren't they? Because actually, you know, if your goal is to belong, then that is going to have an emotional impact on you. And if you achieve that goal and you have that sense of belonging, then that's going to impact positively on your ability. I sometimes worry about belonging only because if we create that as another goal for people and they're like, well, what does that mean? And do I belong? And did I actually ever think I wanted to belong? I just want to study physics. In a way that, you know, creates another set of emotions. So I do think it's related, and I think, like all of this, we need to think quite critically about how we sort of combine the two things. But yeah, for sure, feeling like you belong is a really good baseline for you then to kind of engage in the complex stuff that students are doing. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a brilliant point, Wayne, and what I've been struggling with that, because Kate and I have been talking about, if we're pushing belonging, are we adding yet another stressor to the system? And can belonging be sort of forced and unnatural? And I don't know quite whether this is true yet, but I'm coming round to the idea that what Kate was talking about, this emotional socialization, that is a sort of naturally developed belonging, not an imposed one. So I think our students are very much more intuitive. And lots of them recognise that group where there's a degree of socialised emotion, shared feeling. And that sort of belonging is probably much more beneficial and is less extra burden. And I think by saying we all should belong, that's a sort of artificial belonging that can be an extra burden. So I haven't quite teased it out in my head yet, but I think this idea of shared emotion is maybe the natural home of belonging. And it goes back to what you were saying about the isolation. You don't get that shared emotional belonging if you're doing everything remotely from a study bedroom. And you're missing out on the good and helpfully bad emotions of being in it together. And we did some work a while ago looking at belonging in competitive environments other than higher education. And we looked at things like elite sports and armed forces, and they have different times. but it's getting through the tough times together that gives them this huge sense of shared belonging.
Your question. I don't know, I saw.
I was thinking about practitioners and personas, and the personas that we display when it comes to teaching.
Yeah,
And I think, from my experience, I've seen that, you know, if you are emotionally happy, feeling good about yourself, and you display that persona in front of students, the students also feel good.
yes,
And
definitely.
I think, as practitioners, I think even though we may go through stressful times, sometimes we have to sort of mask
Yeah,
those feelings
Mm.
and, you know, go out there and display these feelings of happiness just to, you know, transfer that happiness over to students. So that's how I sort of see emotion being played
yeah.
within.
I'm really glad you raised that point, Mal, because I agree with you. And I think that actually that's a lovely counterpoint to being very open with our emotion, is that actually as professionals, we're always kind of trying to decide when would it be helpful to kind of share this emotion, and whether we're willing to, and whether that's just going to be a distraction for students, or whether, you know, they're going to think, oh wow, if the teacher's worried, then maybe I should be too. So I think that's a very important point. Yeah, thanks for making that. So it's a good balance. Shall we finish there, and then we can have a break before the next session?